In the heavy, breathless autumn of 1851, when the air in New Orleans clung to the skin like a fever, the St. Louis Hotel prepared for a sale that should not exist. Under its great rotunda, beneath the painted dome where light filtered down in a hazy circle, fortunes were traded the way gamblers passed cards. Quickly, carelessly, without a second thought for the lives beneath the numbers. Cotton kings leaned on marble railings, sugar barons counted coins with ringed fingers, and the language of the room was simple: profit, loss, ownership. But on that particular afternoon, something stepped into the center of that world that did not belong to it. She was listed in the catalogue as Lot 402. Name Amara. No surname, no plantation of origin, no record of skills. Just a body price and a brief uneasy note in the margin of the ledger. Subject of uncommon appearance. Silence disturbs the other stock. The auctioneer, John Baptist Muir, had written those words himself, though his hand had hesitated before the ink touched paper. Muir's ledgers were usually immaculate. Columns straight as rails, descriptions precise, every transaction documented with the cold neatness of a banker counting coins. But the lines around Lot 402 looked different, as if his hand had trembled. Witnesses who lived long enough to talk about that day would later insist on one thing first: Amara was not merely beautiful. Beauty was common enough under that rotunda, priced and weighed like sugar. No, what she carried was something else. They spoke of a stillness that did not belong in a room full of shouting men. When the handlers led her onto the block, the noise died so fast it felt as if someone had sucked all the sound out of the air. No crying, no pleading, no shaking shoulders. Amara stood barefoot on the wood as if she had chosen the spot herself, chin level, eyes open. Breathing so calm it was almost disrespectful. Her gaze moved slowly across the crowd. Not like a frightened person scanning for mercy, not like a submissive person avoiding offense. She looked at them the way a magistrate might regard prisoners, measuring, weighing, judging. One planter later wrote to his wife that her expression reminded him of a judge at a hanging. He did not say whether he felt like the judge or the condemned. Muir cleared his throat and tried to wrestle the moment back under his control. Lot 402, female approximately 25 years of age, he called, his voice echoing under the dome. Sound constitution, unblemished to be sold without encumbrance. He did not read the rest of his notes aloud, the parts about the way other captives fell silent when she entered a room. The way one child had begun screaming when she passed, shouting that the lady's eyes were too loud. Those details stayed in ink, pressed between the pages of the red ledger. The men gathered below the block saw only what they wanted to see: a rare specimen, a perfect ornament to their estates, a prize that would make other men jealous. The first bid came before Muir finished his opening call. 2,000. Someone snapped. 20. 500. 3. The numbers leapt as if the room had been waiting months for this moment. Muir watched men he knew as cautious calculators throw restraint aside. One of them, a sugar planter with a reputation for brutal thrift, bid a sum that should have made him wince. He didn't even blink. Whatever force usually governed price and value in that room had stepped aside. They were not buying labor. They were not buying skill. They were buying the right to say she belongs to me and watch other men swallow their envy. Up on the block, Amara did not flinch. When the numbers passed 4,000, hands began to drop. The room thinned around two competitors who locked eyes across the rotunda. One was already known, Henry Duguay, a cotton man whose wealth had inflated faster than old families felt was respectable. He liked attention, he liked risk, and he had never seen a table he didn't want to sit at. His rival, after a long, tense pause, hesitated, then lowered his hand. $5,200, Muir announced, more to stabilize himself than the crowd. His voice shook only on the last word. Sold to Monsieur Henry Duguay. The hammer fell, and with it something else, a line. A boundary. The last moment in which the men of Louisiana could pretend the world worked the way they thought it did. As Duguay stepped forward to claim his purchase, more than one man in the room felt the temperature drop. It was not imagination. The hotel was stifling hot that day, windows open, fans turning, jackets damp with sweat. And yet, as Amara descended from the block and walked past them, a faint cold brushed their faces. A touch of winter, wrong and thin and momentary. 3 separate diaries from that week mention it. None of them offer an explanation. Duguay didn't care about the chill. He saw only the envy in the eyes around him. He laughed when a rival cautioned him. "You paid too dear for a ghost, Henry," the man muttered. "Something about her is not right." Duguay clapped him on the shoulder. "Men fear what they cannot afford," he replied. "I can afford it." He led Amara out beneath the high arches of the rotunda and into the blazing light of the courtyard. The city pressed around them. Carriages rattling, vendors calling, the Mississippi breathing its thick, muddy breath a few blocks away. But as the carriage doors closed and Amara climbed in without a word, the driver later swore he felt the horses shy, as if they too had seen something their minds had no language for. The road from the St. Louis Hotel to Henry Dugay's estate was not long, but he would later describe it in his confiscated journals as the longest 20 minutes of my life, though I could not then have said why. She sat opposite him, hands folded, eyes lowered, but not humble. The silence in that carriage was dense enough to feel. Not the silence of submission, something else, something that seemed to lean against him without moving at all. He tried to speak to her, asked her age, her previous duties, her place of birth. Nothing. He snapped his fingers, annoyed. "You are mine now. You will answer when I speak." For one brief heartbeat, she lifted her eyes to his. There was no fear in them, no hatred, only a kind of deep, exhausting knowledge. He looked away first. The estate rose ahead of them, the big house with its columns, the long shadows of slave quarters stretched out behind it, the sugar fields beyond. It was a kingdom bought with blood and cane and clever credit. Until that afternoon, Henry Dugay had believed himself absolutely sovereign within its boundaries. By the time the carriage wheels crunched over his own gravel drive, something in him already knew that was no longer true. The house felt different the moment she crossed the threshold. He would later try to describe it, failing each time. A weight in the air, a sense of being watched in every room. Dogs that normally hurled themselves at strangers now backing into corners. Hackles raised, refusing to go near her. Servants went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with fear of their master. They kept their eyes low, but they saw her. And in the kitchens and corridors, where white men never bothered to listen, someone whispered a word that would follow Amara wherever she went. Truth. That first night, Dugay ordered that she be given quarters close to the main house. She was too valuable, he said, to be left among the common field hands. A prize should be displayed near its owner. But Amara did not behave like property. She did not unpack the small bundle given to her. She did not lay on the narrow bed. She did not sit at all. Instead, as the lamps were lit and the estate settled into its usual rhythms, Amara found a room near the nursery and stood in it. Not roaming, not pacing, not weeping, just standing, facing one particular section of wall, unmoving. Hours slipped past. Servants brought blankets. She did not take them. They tried to guide her away. She did not resist, but as soon as hands left her arms, she drifted back to the same spot, her gaze fastening once more on that simple, unremarkable stretch of plaster. By midnight, even the bravest avoided that room. By the second day, Dugay began to feel something he did not recognize in himself. Not superstition, not guilt, just a tiny crack in the confidence that had made him rich. Why that wall? What did she see? He told himself it was nonsense. He told himself she was simple. He told himself he was still in control. But on the third day, it was not Amara who broke the silence. It was his wife, standing in the nursery with a crowbar in her shaking hands, staring at the same piece of wall this stranger had watched without blinking for 48 hours. What she found behind the plaster would destroy the illusion of Henry Dugay's perfect life. But that part of the story belongs to another chapter. For now, remember this: in a world where human beings were reduced to lines in a ledger, lot 402 was the first entry that refused to behave like ink. She did not shout. She did not fight. She simply looked at the places where the truth was buried, and the truth, all on its own, began to dig its way out. The Duguay estate had seen its share of storms. Hurricanes had torn at its shutters, floods had licked at its foundations, and fires had burned in its fields. But the real disaster began with a crowbar and a woman who had finally run out of ways to lie to herself. For 2 days, Amara stood in that small room off the nursery, facing the same blank section of wall. The servants whispered, crossing themselves when they passed the doorway. Children refused to sleep nearby. Even the maids who'd seen beatings, births, and burials in that house stepped lightly when her stillness was in view. Henry Duguay told himself it was nonsense, a nervous trick. The house staff were always ready to turn shadows into spirits. On the 3rd day, he came home to find his wife in the nursery. She was not the kind of woman who lifted her voice in anger or her hands in work. She moved through their home like an expensive piece of furniture. Polished, decorative, untouched by labor. But now she stood in a torn dress, hair half loose, white-knuckled around the handle of a crowbar. The plaster at the spot Amara had been staring at lay in broken chunks on the floor. Dust filled the air. "What in God's name are you doing?" Duguay barked, stepping into the doorway. His wife did not jump, did not look away from the hole in the wall. "Tell me," she said, her voice strangely calm. "Is there anything in this house that belongs to me?" He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died when he saw what lay in the cavity behind the lath. A bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. A small, delicate locket, tarnished but unmistakably expensive. His name was on the letters, written in a hand that was not his wife's. She lifted the locket first, opened it. Inside, a miniature portrait stared back, a young woman, dark-haired, soft-eyed, wearing an expression Duguay had once called home, and later called complication. Beneath the portrait was a lock of hair tied with silk. His wife's hands did not shake as she set the locket aside and picked up the letters. The ribbon slipped. Pages fell open. Words tumbled into the light. Promises, confessions, pet names, references to money wired quietly, to rooms rented under false names, to children he visited on the road, during business trips. Children his wife read in silence for what felt like hours. When she finally looked up, her face had become something Duguay had never seen before, not rage, not grief. Clarity. "How long?" she asked softly. "Have you used my dowry to feed them?" Down the hall, in the shadows near the doorway, Amara stood motionless. She had not touched the wall, had not pointed, had not spoken. She had simply chosen that spot in that room, and stared at it until someone who lived with the lie could no longer bear to leave it sealed. Later, much later, Duguay would swear under oath that he had forgotten those letters existed, that he didn't know the locket was there, that the hiding place had been chosen in a moment of panic and then wiped clean from his mind. But the wall remembered. Amara remembered. And now, his wife remembered too. The rest happened quickly, because once one truth gets loose, it tends to drag others after it. Servants were questioned. Travel dates were compared. Numbers in ledgers stopped adding up. The Duguay marriage, which had always looked so smooth from the outside, cracked in an instant, not by rumor, not by gossip, but by evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence pulled out of a hole in the home itself. That night, the estate did not sleep. Doors slammed. Luggage was dragged. Voices rose and fell. Henry Duguay sat alone in his study, the taste of dust still in his mouth. The letters lay spread across his desk like a trial transcript. In the corner of the room, his dog, once fiercely loyal, refused to come near him. It lay with its muzzle on its paws, eyes fixed not on its master, but on the hallway where Amara had last been seen. By sunrise, Duguay had made his decision. He could not punish her. She had never touched a single hidden thing. He could not explain what she had done. He could not forgive what she had revealed. The only thing he could do was get her out of his house. Return to the rotunda, the St. Louis Hotel was already stirring by the time Duguay's carriage rolled into the courtyard. Muir, the auctioneer, was on the steps, sipping coffee, rehearsing the day's sales in his head. He did not expect to see lot 402 again. Certainly not so soon. Henry Duguay climbed down first. He looked terrible, paler, thinner, as if the night had scraped something out of him. Amara stepped down next. No shackles, no marks, no visible sign that anything had happened at all. Muir's eyes narrowed. Monsieur Duguay, to what do I owe the? I'm returning her, Duguay said flatly. Muir blinked. Returning? This is not a bolt of fabric, sir. You cannot simply. Duguay slammed a folded paper into his hand. The ink shook across the page, but the words were clear enough. Return, defect in character, incompatible with domestic peace. Muir glanced from the paper to Dugay's face. Defect? What defect? Duguay laughed once. It was not a sane sound. The kind that knows where you keep your sins, he said. Sell her to someone else. Lose money if you must. I'll take the loss. You understand, you forfeit a portion of. I understand, Duguay snapped. I will pay twice that to forget I ever brought her into my house. He did not say goodbye to Amara. He did not look her in the eyes. He turned and walked away across the courtyard with the gait of a man who had been pushed out of his own life and did not yet know where else to go. Muir watched him go, then turned slowly toward Amara. She stood in the shadow of the archway, calm as ever. Her gaze was on him this time. For the first time since she appeared in his world, Jean Baptiste Muir felt a sensation he had never associated with his profession's shame. The ledger he held suddenly seemed very heavy. He escorted her back inside, telling himself it was just business. Property sometimes came back, sales occasionally unraveled, but as he reopened the red ledger and wrote the return notation beneath her original sale, his usually perfect handwriting faltered again. Ink pooled at the corner of the R in returned. The line looked like a drop of blood. The second sale convention dictated that a returned lot should see its value decrease. Assets that came back to the block were marked down, their flaws whispered about in back rooms. But the moment word spread that Henry Duguay had returned his most expensive purchase in a panic, something twisted in the way men talked about Lot 402. His humiliation fed the legend. By the time Muir brought her back under the rotunda, the story had already warped. Duguay lost his nerve, someone said. The woman unnerved his wife. Another added. I heard she refused to work. A third muttered. Muir knew better than to ask questions that might bring answers he didn't want. He cleared his throat, ignoring the way his chest felt too tight, and called out, Lot 400, female. Amara to be sold again. This time, the crowd watched her with a different kind of hunger. Not just desire, not just envy, challenge. If she had broken Duguay, the logic went. It was because Duguay was weak, a man with nothing to hide. A man truly worthy of owning such a prize would have nothing to fear. The first bid came from a tall, broad-shouldered man near the front. Dressed in immaculate linen despite the heat, he said. Louis Fontenot. Sugarcane money, 300 enslaved workers, a reputation for efficiency so brutal that even other planters called him cold-blooded when he was out of earshot. He prided himself on his rational mind, on his disbelief in ghosts, curses, and all the other nonsense that kept lesser men awake at night. Today, he saw an opportunity to buy the woman who had made Henry Duguay look like a fool, and prove, publicly, that he was stronger than any whispered curse. 5,200. Someone counted half-heartedly. 5,500, Fontenot replied without looking to see who he'd overruled. A few more bids came. They didn't last long. Everyone in the room could feel where this was going. Sold, Muir finally declared. To Monsieur Louis Fontenot for the sum of $5,500. The hammer fell. Amara's eyes rose just slightly, just enough to meet the gaze of her new owner. If Henry Duguay's ruin had begun with a wall, Louis Fontenot's would begin with a garden. But that is another part of the story. For now, the pattern had been set. She entered a house. She looked at something everyone else had learned not to see. And when that truth came crawling into daylight, the men who paid thousands for the privilege of owning her could not get rid of her fast enough. The red ledger recorded it all in careful ink. But even on that second sale, Muir knew what he would never say aloud. He was no longer writing ordinary transactions. He was writing the minutes of a haunting. Louis Fontenot's estate stretched for miles along the river, a kingdom carved out of sugarcane and sweat. The land was manicured, ordered, carved into perfect symmetry by overseers who enforced his will with the precision of a blade. Everything had its place. Every person had their task. Every lie had its corner in the dark, where it was meant to stay buried. And then Amara arrived. From the moment Fontenot's carriage rolled past the iron gates, something shifted in the air. The cane fields, always humming with labor, fell strangely quiet. A heaviness settled on the property. Not violent, not sudden, but a tightening, as though the estate itself was holding its breath. Fontenot dismissed it as nonsense. A wealthy man cannot afford superstition, especially not when the eyes of the parish watched him try to tame the woman who had humiliated Henry Duguay. At first, everything went according to plan. Amara did not resist, did not argue, did not show fear. She walked behind Fontenot into the big house, her face still and unreadable, her steps soundless on the polished floors. The servants watched from the halls, not daring to whisper. Even they felt it, the ripple in the air around her, the same uneasy current animals sense before a storm. Fontenot assigned her fine quarters near the main house, a sign of her value. He believed she would elevate the aesthetic of his home, a living trophy of beauty and discipline. But he quickly learned something Duguay had discovered too late. Amara did not settle into homes. She haunted them. The first sign, within hours, the household rhythm faltered. Dogs on the property began whining at night. Cattle refused to move through certain gates. A stable boy ran from the barn claiming he felt someone breathing behind him when no one was there. Fontenot ignored it. He always ignored what he could not measure. But the unease sharpened into something undeniable that evening, as the sun dipped behind the moss-draped oaks. Amara did not sleep in the room assigned to her. She did not rest in the quarters at all. Instead, she stood in the rose garden, perfectly still, facing a patch of earth beneath the oldest oak on the property. Just staring, a single lantern glow reflected in her eyes, unmoving. When Fontenot found her, irritation pulled at his jaw. "This is not your place," he snapped. "Move." She did not turn, did not blink, did not acknowledge him. His anger rose. He stepped closer, ready to drag her away if he must. But then he felt something. Something he hadn't felt since childhood, when a priest told him God watched every sin he committed. Judgment. It radiated from her without a word. He told himself he imagined it. But the tremor in his hand, the sudden dryness in his throat, these were not illusions. He went back inside, unsettled. But Amara remained at that spot until morning. The daughter who heard the cry on the second day, Fontenot's youngest daughter, a bright-eyed 6-year-old, wandered into the garden. She had always been fearless, curious, too young to understand the weight adults carried. She saw Amara first, then she froze. Her small face twisted in fear. "What do you hear?" her mother asked, kneeling beside her. The girl pointed at the rose garden. "The baby," she whispered. "The baby that cries under the ground." A chill ran through the house, not because of the words, but because every adult on that estate knew that no one had told the child there ever was a baby. Fontenot dismissed her fears with a harsh tongue, but that night he poured 2 extra fingers of whiskey before bed. His hands shook too much for one. The digging by the third day, the house had changed. Servants walked nervously. The mistress prayed more. Fontenot himself avoided the garden even when passing by its windows. So when his wife, normally obedient, decorative, and silent, stormed into the garden shouting for the gardener to bring a spade, Fontenot was too stunned to react. "Stop this," he barked. "You'll ruin the beds." But she didn't stop. She was pale, feverish, driven by an instinct she didn't understand but couldn't deny. The gardener hesitated, terrified of both master and mistress. But it was the mistress who commanded him, and her voice trembled with a conviction that outweighed Fontenot's fury. He dug. 1 foot. 3. The spade hit something that wasn't soil. A linen sack. Old, decaying, small, very small. When the gardener lifted it, it crumbled in places. Inside were bones, tiny, fragile human, and wrapped around the remains was a scrap of embroidered cloth. A crest, the Fontenot crest. The mistress gasped. Fontenot froze as though struck by lightning. He recognized the fabric instantly. He had given it to a young woman once, a governess he'd seduced, then discarded. She had disappeared one night, rumors swirling, but Fontenot had buried the truth deeper than the grave he'd dug. Until Amara found it. She had never been inside the house, never spoken to anyone, never asked a single question. And yet she knew exactly where the sin lay. The ruin of Louis Fontenot, his wife, collapsed into sobs that rattled the entire estate. Fontenot felt every eye on him, his wife, his daughter, his servants, even the gardener kneeling with dirt-covered hands. He had spent years constructing a fortress of respectability. Amara toppled it in 3 silent nights. He returned her the next morning, did not haggle, did not shout, did not accuse her of witchcraft. He simply handed her back with a shaking hand and a note in the ledger reading returned. Unsuitable. Bad omen. He lost 1,000 on the transaction. He would have lost 10 times that just to see her gone from his land. But as he left the rotunda, he felt something he had not felt in decades: fear of being seen. What Amara revealed, she did not bring lies with her. She brought their truth. She did not judge. She simply pointed. She did not destroy houses. She uncovered what already rotted inside them. In 3 days, she exposed a crime buried under rose petals and lies. And as she stood once more beneath the dome of the St. Louis Hotel, silent and still, a new truth settled into the bones of every man watching her. She was not cursed. She was a reckoning. Judge Ehin Lele of Baton Rouge believed in 2 things above all else: law and order. He trusted paper. He trusted signatures. He trusted locks made of thick, imported iron. He did not trust superstition. So when he heard the whispers about the woman returned twice in disgrace, the woman whose silent gaze had ruined a cotton magnate and exposed a sugar baron, he did not tremble like the others. He smirked. If Amara had shattered those men, Lair reasoned, it was because their foundations were already cracked. Men with weak morals always feared the mirror. But he judged Lair had nothing to fear, or so he believed. He bought her for 5,800, paying without hesitation. A crowd watched him sign the ledger, some with pity, others with a morbid curiosity. A few advised him quietly not to tempt fate. He brushed them off. "My house," he said, "is built on truth." But his house was built on something far more fragile: the illusion of innocence. The first night, the judge's home was arranged like a shrine. Everything alphabetical, symmetrical, polished. Books stood in perfect rows. Portraits hung at precise angles. Even the servants walked as though afraid to disturb the geometry. Amara's presence collapsed that order in a matter of hours. She did not wander, did not explore, did not settle. She simply drifted toward the judge's private study and stopped. Then she stood there, not touching the door, not trying the handle, just staring at the heavy iron safe inside. A safe no one but the judge had touched in 10 years. When Lair found her, standing in the moonlight, her silhouette framed against the iron box, a flicker of discomfort passed through him. "This room is forbidden," he snapped. She didn't move. He stepped closer. "Leave now." Still nothing. For a brief, startling moment, he had the sense that he was the intruder, that the room no longer belonged to him, that she knew something he had buried so deeply he had convinced himself the earth had swallowed it. He dismissed the feeling. Rational men do not fear shadows. But that night he locked his bedroom door. The second night it wasn't Amara who broke the silence. It was his son, a curious young man, a law student, who wandered into the study after dark and found her there again, still as marble, still facing the safe. "Feather," he asked at breakfast, "what do you keep in that iron box?" The question shouldn't have meant anything, shouldn't have sounded like an accusation. But Lair choked on his coffee, his hands trembled. He muttered something about documents of no concern, but his son's eyes narrowed with the sharp intuition of youth. That afternoon, while the judge was in court, his son used a key he had once stolen out of childish mischief. He opened the safe. Inside was not money, Not jewelry, not any harmless artifact. It was a forged will, a document that had stripped several cousins of their inheritance and funneled their fortune into Judge Leah's own pockets. He had committed fraud, perjury, theft of a legacy, and he had hidden it away, telling himself the crime was justified. But lies do not rot in silence, they ferment. The confrontation when the judge returned home, the house was not quiet. His son stood in the study, the forged will trembling in his hand. "You stole my birthright," the boy whispered. Leah's knees weakened. No denial came, no defense. The truth lay open on the table, illuminated by the same moonlight that had glinted off Amara's eyes the night before. Behind them in the hallway stood Amara, not gloating, not judging, just watching. A silent witness to a crime finally exposed. The judge's voice broke. It was only ink," he stammered. "Only paper." But the lie was not ink, it was architecture. It had shaped his entire life. His son walked out of the room without another word. He would never return. The return to the rotunda the next morning, Judge Leah delivered Amara back to the St. Louis Hotel without ceremony. He said nothing to Muir. He did not request a refund. He did not attempt to explain. He simply left her on the auction floor and walked out of the rotunda, shoulders hunched, robes trailing like funeral cloth. His ledger notation was one short sentence, the ink smeared as if written with a shaking hand returned. No further comment. The judge resigned his post weeks later, his reputation dissolved. The law he had worshipped turned on him like an animal tasting blood, and the iron safe in his home. It remained open. No one dared close it. Her pattern grows clearer. 3 households had collapsed. 3 men, powerful, wealthy, respected, had been reduced to rubble. And she had said nothing. She only went where secrets were buried. She only looked where guilt festered. She only stood where truth had been locked away and waited for someone else to be unable to bear the silence. Already, buyers were whispering about her, the silent pearl, the St. Landry gem, the truth-teller. But with each sale, the legend sharpened into something terrible. She did not hunt sins. She revealed them, no matter the cost. And yet more men stepped forward to bid. Because arrogance is a stronger force than fear. Because every man believes his secrets are safer than another's. And because the red ledger, now trembling in Muir's ink-stained hands, was far from finished writing names. By November of 1851, Amara's legend had swollen far beyond the walls of the St. Louis Hotel. What began as a strange curiosity, a beautiful woman returned twice without explanation, had transformed into a whisper that slithered through parlors, plantations, church pews, and courthouse corridors. She was no longer just a person, she was a phenomenon. And like any phenomenon that exposes the truth, she became a storm that grew stronger with each life it shattered. The auctioneer's dread June, Baptist Muir had always loved his work. He loved the rhythm of the rotunda, the fast talk, the flick of ink on fine vellum, the clean finality of a hammer striking oak. The ledger, to him, was scripture, order, commerce, civilization. But by the time he wrote Leah's return, he no longer recognized his own handwriting. It trembled, blurred, sank into the paper like something trying to escape. The red ledger itself felt cursed, because every time he wrote, returned, another powerful man fled his own home, pale and shaking, unwilling to admit what she had shown him. But business is business, and greed is louder than fear. So Muir inked the next sale. And that was when the avalanche began. The fourth buyer, the shipping magnate, the buyer, was a wealthy maritime merchant from Algiers, a man who had built an empire on the river. Ships, warehouses, crews, contracts. The type of man whose boots echoed with confidence, whose laugh filled rooms, whose handshake squeezed too tight. He purchased Amara on a Tuesday. By Friday, his wife, who had spent years in quiet humiliation, burst into the rotunda clutching a handful of receipts she'd discovered stuffed behind a painting in her husband's office. Brothel visits, illicit deals made against church funds, all neatly documented. Amara had simply walked into the office and stood before that painting for hours, staring at the frame. The wife said nothing when she returned Amara. She only handed Muir the reins, whispered, "I do not want her near my house," and left. The shipping magnate disappeared from public life within a month. The fifth buyer, the plantation owner of Point Coupe, this man lasted a week. A week before his entire enslaved workforce suddenly refused to move. Not violently, not rebelliously, just silence. They stood in lines in fields, in rows, staring at the ground where Amara had once paused near a toolshed. The overseers panicked. The man shouted. But no amount of violence could break the stillness. It was as if the land itself had decided to stop answering to him. The moment Amara was escorted off the property, the labor resumed. He paid Muir to burn her contract and never speak his name again. But the ledger never forgets. The sixth buyer, the deacon, a holy man, a preacher, a man whose voice could make congregations tremble. He lasted only days. Amara stood in the corner of his study, staring at the floorboards. When the deacon's wife pried them open, she found his private journals, pages filled with blasphemies, doubts, secret vices, desires he had thundered against from the pulpit. He didn't return her. His wife did. She didn't bother entering the rotunda. She handed Muir her purchase slip through the door, turned on her heel, and left. The ledger becomes a record of collapse. Muir found himself documenting the unraveling of Louisiana's elite, as if he were writing battle reports. Returned. Financial ruin. Returned. Hysterical household. Returned. Grounds unrest. Returned. Personal disgrace. Every entry was a confession disguised as commerce. Amara never touched a soul, never accused a man, never lifted a finger. She simply found the quietest place in each home, the place where the truth lived, and stood beside it. And the truth, once seen, did what truth always does. It destroyed the liar first. The women begin to take notice. This was the part no man predicted. The wives, the daughters, the sisters, they watched. They whispered among themselves. They saw that the men feared Amara, not because she was dangerous, but because she knew where their darkness was buried. And for the first time in years, decades, women in Louisiana's aristocratic households felt a flicker of something they had been taught to kill: hope. They did not fear her, they hungered for her. Because Amara was not a destroyer, she was a key, a scalpel, a spotlight, a woman who could walk into a home and reveal the rot men had forced their wives to live with in silence. Letters between society women from this period, rare, yellowed, preserved in attics and archives, speak of her with awe. She holds the keys they denied us. She sees what we fear to ask. If only she came to my home. For the first time in the South's polished society, the women and the enslaved shared a quiet, dangerous alliance, because they both knew the truth. Power is not in possession, it is in knowledge. And Amara possessed knowledge in its purest, most terrifying form. The fear in the rotunda. By the time her seventh buyer approached the podium, no man stepped near her without feeling the weight of their own conscience settling on their shoulders like chains. Even Muir avoided her eyes, not because he feared judgment, but because he feared recognition. He worried deeply, secretly, that she had memorized his sins too. And still men bid. They bid because arrogance is endless, because wealth makes men reckless, because they believed they were different. They believed they were good. But Amara was not seeking evil, she was seeking truth. And truth was abundant. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Returns accelerated, not months apart, not weeks apart, days, sometimes hours. Every powerful man in Louisiana believed he could withstand her. Every powerful man was wrong. And yet, the escalation was not the frightening part. The frightening part was this: her gaze was drifting higher, past planters, past merchants, past clergy, toward political power, toward the men whose sins were not just personal but structural, toward the secrets that did not ruin families, they ruined states. By the end of November, the whisper had grown into a warning: keep her away from the senators. If she enters a courthouse, God help us all. Some truths are too big to survive. But one senator did not heed the warning. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he was immune. He believed he was master of the land she walked on, and he was wrong, deadly wrong. Because the ledger was turning its final page. and the next name written into it would be the most powerful and the most doomed of all. The clock inside Belter Plantation struck midnight, but the house did not sleep. It waited. Amara stood in the sewing room, lit only by the dull orange glow of a dying candle. Her silence had become a language, one the women of Belter now understood with terrifying clarity, because they knew what dawn would bring. Senator Leonidas Thorne planned to take Amara into the swamp and kill her. Not out of fear, not out of justice, out of desperation. If she lived, the truth of his past would rise. If she died, the truth would die with her. He believed murder would save him. He was wrong. The discovery that changed everything hours earlier, as Thorne paced drunkenly in his locked study, Eleanor Thorne, quiet, obedient Eleanor, climbed to the attic with trembling hands. Amara had led her there with the smallest gesture, a tilt of the head, a glance toward the ceiling, a message without words. Look. In the attic, buried in dust and moth-eaten cloth, Eleanor found an old military greatcoat belonging to Thorne's father. Inside the lining was a packet of brittle papers tied with discolored twine, a deed, a Spanish land grant from 1790, proof that the Cavalier family, not the Thornes, were the rightful owners of the land Belter stood on. And beneath it, folded like a confession shoved into a grave, a letter handwritten, dated 1825, a dying man's admission. He and his son, Leonidas Thorne, burned the Cavalier cabin with the family trapped inside. They listed every victim by name. Pierre Cavalier, Marie Cavalier, their 7 children, and at the bottom, the youngest child fled into the swamp. We never found her. We assumed the gators took her, but the gators had not taken her. She had survived. She had returned. Amara was not a curse, not a myth, not a witch. She was a witness, and she had been standing in the ruins of her childhood home. The decision Eleanor felt the weight of 2 possible futures: hide the truth and protect her wealth, or expose it and destroy her family forever. She looked at her daughters, young women shaped by lies they never chose. She looked at Sarah, the housekeeper, who had endured decades under Thorne's rule. She looked at Amara, who watched her with the eyes of the past, and Eleanor made the choice that would echo for generations. "We reveal it," she whispered. For the first time in her life, she chose truth over survival. The planned 7 letters, 7 sealed packets. Inside each a copy of the Cavalier deed, a copy of Thorne's confession, a written statement by Eleanor Thorne. They would send them to the governor, the bishop, the editor of the Picayune, the federal marshal. 3 of Thorne's most vicious political rivals. Thorne could stop 1 messenger, maybe 2, but 7? Never. At 3 a.m. in the shadows of the stables, Eleanor handed the letters to 7 riders, black and white, servant and mistress working side by side. Stable boy Marcus would later testify. She looked like a soldier, not a senator's wife. She said, "Ride like the devil is chasing you, because he is." The riders vanished into the night, and the world began to turn against Leonidas Thorne. The moment Thorne realized, the thunder of hooves woke him. He ran to the window, pistol in hand, drunk with rage. He saw the riders streaking across his land, carrying his doom in oilskin packets. He fired a shot into the darkness, useless, desperate. He knew instantly the truth was out. He was finished. He tore through the house, roaring for Amara. His footsteps shook the hallways. He smashed open the sewing room door and stopped. The room was empty. The window was open. Cold night air fluttered the curtains. On the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, lay the iron shackles he'd purchased for her. Unlocked, untouched, waiting like a symbol. She had not escaped. She had ascended. She did not need chains. She had broken her captor instead. Thorne's last act as the first pale light of dawn crept across the swamp. A single gunshot echoed from Thorne's study. The women did not rush to the room. No one screamed. They knew what it meant. The Lion of Sate, Landry, had finally choked on his own secrets. The storm after what followed was not a scandal. It was a purge. The editor of the Picayune ran the headline. Esino or tuarnexpudite bar messasiabiavia. Courts seized the plantation. Officials who had colluded with Thorne fell like dominoes. Investigations spread across the state, overturning decades of corruption. Eleanor and her daughters left Belter with nothing but their dignity. Sarah and the servants walked free the next day, their chains metaphorically shattered. The Cavalier land was auctioned by the state and used to build an orphanage, irony clawed from tragedy. And Amara, she vanished. The woman without a grave, no search party ever found her. No marshals tracked her, no grave bears her name. But she was seen once more, or so the story goes. In 1895, in a Paris antique shop, a historian found a daguerreotype of a woman wearing the Cavalier family crest. She looked 25. She should have been 70. Her eyes held the same unbearable intensity. Those who look at the photograph say her gaze feels alive, as if she's still searching, still remembering, still revealing, because the truth is eternal. It waits, and sometimes it walks. The impossible secret: Amara was never truly sold, never owned, never possessed. She was the bill coming due for every lie, every theft, every buried crime. And somewhere, perhaps, the ledger remains open, ink unfaded, names waiting, because history does not sleep, it haunts, and she was its voice.